So, as requested by Mr. Basaraj, I'll start with the history of the temple, the family, and then connect it to the legal aspects. I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. And at any stage, if anybody has a question, you can perhaps send it to Mr. Basaraj and he will route it to me. So, the entire story of this particular judgment is about the relationship between the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple in Tirunelveli and the Travancore royal family. So you have the temple and you have the family. The relationship between these two entities is effectively at the heart of this particular story. And this is something that will play itself out on the political front as well as the legal front, but primarily on the legal front. Now, the Travancore family has a long history, which for all practical purposes is inseparable from the history of the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple itself, because it enjoys a very special relationship with this particular temple. So I had the opportunity to represent the chief committee of this particular temple, along with other devotee organizations, who gave me as much scriptural support as well as legal support to present before the court the nature of the relationship and the history of the relationship between these two entities. Now, this particular temple has a history which goes into the Puranic period as well, and it is recorded in Hindu Itihasas for a very long time. So much so that the Sangam literature of, let's say, the region that we know as Tamil Nadu today, even recognizes the annual Avanti festival which is conducted in the honor of the presiding deity of the temple, which is Sri Padmanabha Swami. So that is the antiquity and that is the ancient nature of this particular temple. This entire region, Kerala, Konkan, and even coastal parts of Karnataka, this entire region is known as Parashurama Kshetra for all practical purposes by those who believe in the Hindu scripture. And therefore, almost every temple in Kerala has some influence or the other of Lord Parashurama and the tradition started by him. So in particular, there are about 9 temples all over the world which follow a particular form of tradition or sampradaya, which is known as Parashurama Paddhati. And among the foremost temples which subscribe to this particular tradition or sampradaya is the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple. So for all practical purposes, within the mega universe of Hindu fold, within that there is a specific sampradaya, and within that there is a further sampradaya, which is the Parashurama sampradaya. And for all practical purposes, I think that it qualifies as a denomination for the purposes of Article 26 of the Constitution. I'll come back to that later. So the tradition believes that Lord Parashurama himself played a role in the establishment and the consecration of the Ananta Padmanabha Swami temple, and he appointed the ruler of the region known as the Venad region. Travancore was previously known as Venad, and the rulers of this particular region as the defenders of the temple, as effectively the ones who will protect the dharma of this particular temple. And this is a relationship that is traceable several thousand years ago, way before even, let's say, the legendary ruler of Travancore, Anirudh showed up on the scene in the 1700s. So, if you look at the history of the family and if you ask them what is it that they believe in, they believe that the very origin of the family and the temple are tied together. That is the antiquity of both the family as well as the temple. And therefore, they believe that this is perhaps the oldest unbroken And Padmanabhadasa is present almost in every male member's name if they have undergone that particular ceremony. In fact, if you look at the manner in which their names are actually constructed, it makes for a great insight. So, if anybody remembers the ruler who signed the accession agreement on behalf of the princely state of Travancore with India, his name was Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma. Chitra Tirunal is actually a reference to the birth star, Chitra star. So Tirunal basically means that particular auspicious day with the Chitra Nakshatram. So Chitra Tirunal, his name is Balarama Varma, and his entire name starts as Sri Padmanabhadasa Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma. That's how their names are even constructed. So that's how the tradition is. Okay. So similarly, you have one of the famous Carnatic geniuses, Swati Tirunal. So Swati Tirunal is not his name, that is actually the nakshatram or the birth star on which he was born. Okay, so his name comes after that. So that is the history of or that is how this particular dynasty has contributed to either arts or culture, or for that matter, the manner in which this particular temple has been a pattern to culture in that particular region. So there are three phases in which you have to understand the relationship between the family and the temple. Phase number one starts from the Puranic phase until 1750, and phase 2 starts from 1750 to 1949. Phase 3 starts from 1949 and subsequently, so 1949 to 1971 and 1971 to 2020. What is the significance of these phases? In January 1750, the then king of the Kingdom of Travancore, who defeated the Dutch in the Battle of Colachel in 1741, Martanda Varma, effectively does something which is historic. He dedicates the Kingdom of Travancore to the deity of the temple, Sri Padmanabha Swami, and makes the deity the ruler of that particular kingdom. And he formally takes the title Padmanabhadasa. And every proclamation, every decision, every covenant, every treaty which is taken or issued or made by this particular kingdom is henceforth done in the name of the deity. And the deity is also given a particular title, Deshanathan, which effectively means Lord of the state. Okay. And the ruler sees himself as the representative of the deity, with the deity itself being the ruler. So, for all practical purposes, who we see as the earthly ruler merely becomes a regent or a representative and nothing beyond. Okay. So this is the position that was formally recorded in January 1750, when this particular process of dedication was undertaken by the king at that particular point in time, and there is an unbroken tradition of his successors abiding by this particular tradition even till date. So every head of the Travancore royal family adopts for himself this prefix, this surname, Sri Padmanabhadasa, sees himself as the servant of the deity, as an eternal servant of the deity who is bound by the traditions of the temple, and sees himself primarily as the defender. What is the extent of commitment of this family to this particular temple becomes very, very clear when in 1949, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, through his right-hand man, V.P. Menon, approached the king asking Travancore to become part of the Indian Union. So as everybody knows, India today is the product of the process of integration taken by Sri Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. And he was supported in this particular initiative and aided in this initiative by his secretary to the Ministry of States, namely Sri V.P. Menon. And Sri V.P. Menon would be the one to negotiate with each king of the princely state, asking them their terms and conditions in order for them to become part of the Indian Union. Now, there is a beautiful book written by Sri V.P. Menon on the process of this integration, known as the Story of Integration of the Indian States, which captures in detail the kind of negotiations and the subject of negotiations that took place between the Indian Union on the one hand and the Travancore princely state on the other. The then Maharaja Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma effectively was concerned about the relationship between the family and the temple if the Travancore state becomes part of the Indian Union. That occupies the negotiations to such an extent that it would have been a deal breaker if the Indian Union or the accession to the Indian Union had resulted in any kind of break between the family and the temple. Because they were devout Hindu kings who had completely surrendered their existence and identity at the feet of Lord Padmanabha Swami. That is effectively how they have conducted themselves. So much so, when he was asked to take the oath of office as the Raj Pramukh, which was effectively the position that was given to every king of a princely state, including Maharaja Hari Singh of Jammu and Kashmir, he said, I cannot take oath as the Raj Pramukh because I am not the Pramukh in this particular state. I represent the Raj Pramukh, and the Raj Pramukh happens to be the deity himself. So when he signed the instrument of accession, the ruler did not sign it as the ruler of the princely state, but as the Padmanabhadasa of the ruler who is the deity. That is the extent to which even the covenant which was signed in May 1949 between the Indian Union on the one hand and the Travancore Cochin princely state, the merged state together, specifically record the fact that he signed that particular covenant as a Padmanabhadasa. So the instrument of accession has actually been entered into between the Indian Union on the one hand and Lord Padmanabha Swami on the other as the other party, and Lord Padmanabha Swami being represented by his earthly representative, namely Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama. That is how interesting this particular relationship is. So this covenant that was entered into between these two parties, so to speak, are three parties. So Travancore and Cochin had merged to become the Travancore Cochin state. In fact, Kerala, as we know it today, is Travancore plus Cochin plus parts of Malabar. These three regions came together to become the state of Kerala in 1956. But until then, it was the Travancore Cochin state. In fact, that is why, if you look at the HRC legislation of Kerala, it is still called the Travancore Cochin Hindu Religious Institutions Act of 1950. Because these are the two building blocks of this particular state, the first two building blocks of the state, until parts of Malabar were taken from the Madras Presidency and added to the Travancore Cochin state to give rise to what we know as Kerala today. Now, under this particular covenant, there is a specific article which effectively describes and captures the product of negotiations between the Indian Union and the Travancore royal family with respect to control over the Padmanabha Swami temple. And that particular provision is Article 8. Now, Article 8 of the covenant of this particular document effectively captures three different aspects, which all of us are currently aware of, but we perhaps don't know the history of. Article 8, one limb effectively promises to the Maharaja of Travancore exclusive control over this particular temple, and not just to him, but to his successors as well. Then, thanks to the negotiations between the two parties, another entity is created for the maintenance of other temples in Kerala, which is the Travancore Devaswam Board. So the Travancore Devaswam Board, which is currently responsible for management of Sabarimala and other temples in Kerala, is effectively the product of negotiations between the princely state of Travancore and the Indian Union, which is specifically captured in Article 8 of the covenant entered into between these two entities. The third limb of this particular provision, it relates to the Tripunitra Purnatraisha temple in Cochin, which effectively guarantees a special relationship between the Cochin royal family and that particular temple.
And the feeders and all are generally they start interacting.
Yeah, thank you. So, which is why Article 8 of the covenant becomes an extremely important provision in discussing this entire history of this particular temple. Now, ultimately, that provision is an article in a covenant. It has to translate to a domestic legislation after the constitution has come into existence. So, in 1950, the temple legislation of the state of Travancore Cochin comes about, which is the Travancore Cochin Hindu Religious Institutions Act of 1950. And to ensure that the obligations and the promises made in the covenant are captured in the state legislation, a separate chapter of this particular act, which is chapter 3, is dedicated to this particular temple, and the title of the chapter itself is Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple. Sections 18 to 23 of this particular act captures all the obligations entered into between the parties and what was promised to the princely state and to the ruler of the princely state under the covenant. So Article 8 of the Covenant for all practical purposes is the Gangotri, the source of this entire discussion in modern contemporary history. We believe that the source is even before, but at the very least, the source is Article 8 of the Covenant. And Article 8 of the Covenant has translated to specific provisions of the TCHRI Act of 1950, namely sections 18 to 23 of Chapter 3. Now, under this particular chapter, what is it that has been promised? Section 18 effectively, in fact, each of these provisions, these 6 provisions, they use the word the ruler of Travancore, ruler, on a regular basis. So the word ruler is mentioned in these provisions throughout. And section 18 says that the ruler shall administer the temple through an executive officer appointed by him, who shall operate under his control and supervision. So the ruler appoints an executive officer who is responsible for the day-to-day administration of the temple and who shall be under the control and supervision of the ruler. The other important provision is section 20 of chapter 3 of this 1950 Act, which allows the ruler to appoint a 3-member advisory committee. And every member of this particular committee is nominated by the Raja or the ruler. And what is the role of this advisory committee? As the name itself says, their function and their duty was to advise the Raja in the discharge of his functions with respect to his temple. So you have the executive officer on the one hand, who takes care of the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day administration of the temple. And on the other hand, you have a 3-member advisory committee that advises the Maharaja on policy-related matters. So this is the structure. If you look at the TCHRI Act, even today, it continues to be in the same form from 1950 to 2020. What is important to note is the Act of 1950 has undergone at least 11 to 12 amendments, even in late 2000s and early 2000s. But none of these amendments diluted or changed any portion of sections 18 to 23, which has the consequence of diluting the Maharaja's rule or control over that particular institution, namely the temple. So, to sum it up, there is the Gangotri happens to be the covenant. Under the covenant, there is Article 8. From the Gangotri flows the Ganga, which is the TCHRI Act of 1950. The specific tributary within this particular Ganga is sections 18 to 23, which is part of Chapter 3. And the administrative structure of this particular temple is captured in section 18 and section 20. Section 18 empowers the Maharaja to appoint an executive officer who is responsible for day-to-day administration. Section 20 allows the Maharaja to nominate a 3-member advisory committee who advise him on policy-related aspects. So this is the position until 1950. So from 1750 to 1949 to 1950, this is what happens. Then what happens? What happens is, in 1971, the 26th Amendment comes about, which abolishes privy purses. And please note that privy purses is effectively a promise made by the Indian state to pay these royal families a fixed amount in return for the surrender and in return for the accession. Because several properties which previously belonged to the royal family were also surrendered and the private properties were retained by them. But in return for their accession, they were promised a certain amount. In fact, several members of the Constant Assembly opposed any kind of payment to these people on the ground. That some of these princely states and most of them have effectively been allies of the British. So why are we rewarding them? To which Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel said, please remember that we are able to put together this Indian Union because there is no armed response from the princely states to the formation of the Indian Union. And they are peacefully acceding to the formation of the Indian Union. And whether you like it or not, they have done a lot of good to the people. There are several public institutions in several parts of the country which have been established by the royal families and by the princely states. And therefore, as a token of gratitude, you must pay them this particular amount. Because in the big picture, you are getting India in return for this pittance. So on that particular logic, the privy purses was originally agreed upon. But Mrs. Indira Gandhi, in her wisdom, or whatever one may choose to call it, effectively abolished that particular, let's say, privy purse arrangement, which effectively led to several of these families being ground to the position of poverty and penury. That is also one of the realities that nobody wants to talk about. And it speaks of, let's say, perhaps the lack of gratitude in representatives of the Indian state and their inability to keep their word. So that's one aspect. We don't need to get into that at this stage. So, privy purses was abolished and royal titles and privileges were abolished. So let me just explain one particular nuance here. Once India becomes a republic in 1950, when the constitution comes into existence on the 26th of January 1950, for all practical purposes, the concept of ruler does not exist. It's over, right? So what survives? What is it that 1971 did then? It obviously did not abolish the concept of a ruler because that was already abolished once India came into existence. So what it abolished was the use of titles like Rai Bahadur and Nawab to basically say these titles shall not be recognized anymore. These privileges shall not be recognized anymore. India has become a republic, and in the spirit of republic, those who were previously the Rajas and those who were previously the Nawabs, all of them will have to come down to terra firma, they have to come down to earth, and they must be treated at par with everybody else. No extra behavior, no extra privileges, nothing of that sort. That's effectively the consequence of 1971 abolition. Now, this happens in 1971. Then the ruler of Prince of Travancore, who signed the covenant in May 1949, Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma, he passed away in 1991. So the person who actually facilitated and who agreed to the accession of the Travancore princely state with the Indian Union leaves his mortal coil in the year 1991. This is another landmark. Please just make a note of this because I'll connect all these dots at the next stage. So what happens after 1991? No amendment is undertaken with respect to the Act after 1971 when privy purses was abolished and royal titles were abolished. No amendment is undertaken after the death of the ruler in 1991. And the chapter which relates to the temple continues to use the word ruler all along without any changes being made, even after the 26th Amendment and even after the death of the ruler. Why is this? Because the state government of Kerala all along was aware of the fact that the chapter is a direct consequence of a promise made under the covenant and it is a direct consequence of Article 8 of the covenant, and therefore any amendment made to the chapter which results in dilution of the Maharaja's control over the temple will be a derogation from the promise made under Article 8 of the covenant. Most importantly, any change with respect to that cannot be made just by the state assembly because at the end of the day, it is a covenant made by the Indian Union, not by the state of Kerala, but by the Indian Union with the princely state. So if you look at the 26th Amendment, it was passed by the Indian Parliament, not by the state assembly. It was passed by the Parliament and therefore there was a change made to the obligation given, or let's say the promise made to princely states with respect to privy purses. Therefore, the question of even legislative competence is involved here because one of the questions is it possible for the state government of Kerala to amend Chapter 3 to dilute the position of the Maharaja, which has been guaranteed under Article 8 of the Covenant, which was entered into by the Union of India and not by the state of Kerala? So that's one question. So all of this, please remember this backdrop. So 1750 something happens, 1949 something happens, 1950 something happens, 1971 something happens, and 1991 something happens. These are the dots. And in 1991 the Raja passes away. And his successors continue to be the titular heads of, let's say, the family, which is to say, within the family and within the temple, they continue to be seen as the Maharaja. In 2009, the executive officer appointed by the Maharaja to administer the temple under Section 18, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, he initiates an eviction proceeding against a tenant who has occupied a certain premises which belongs to the temple. and the tenant happens to be a practicing advocate. Now you see what we advocates can do. There is a tenant who is a practicing advocate who lives on the premises which belongs to the Padmanabha Swami temple. He is asked to vacate the place by the executive officer who is responsible for day-to-day administration. The executive officer is someone who is appointed by the Maharaja, therefore his authority is clear, and therefore he has the right and the authority to ask this particular tenant to vacate the place. What does the tenant who is a practicing advocate do? He files a writ petition in 2009 before the Kerala High Court, questioning the authority of the executive officer on the ground that the executive officer itself has no authority because the person who appointed him lost his authority over the temple after the death of the ruler in 1991 or after the abolition of royal titles in 1971. So an eviction proceeding with respect to a tenant who was a practicing advocate resulted in a writ petition where their rights which were promised under the covenant and codified in the Act of 1950 came to be challenged. So most people are not even aware of the fact that an eviction proceeding of a tenant ultimately resulted in such a massive controversy which ended with the judgment of 13th of July 2020. So that's point number one. In addition to that, several, maybe about 2 or 3 employees of the temple administration file similar civil suits as opposed to writ petitions. They file civil suits in various courts of Tirunelveli, questioning the authority of the royal family and also in the process accusing them of mismanaging the temple, saying that no, gold is being taken away, this is being taken away, they should not be in control of the temple anymore. And each of these proceedings was initiated by a disgruntled employee who was sought to be removed because they were backed by employee unions who effectively decided that if you question the appointment of any of our employees, then we will create trouble for you. And that resulted in a spate of civil suits being filed in the courts of Tirunelveli. By this time, I told you that the first ruler who signed this particular covenant passed away, Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma. His younger brother, Uttaradam Tirunal Martanda Varma, who was then the head of the family, approaches the High Court to basically say all of these civil suits which are pending in various courts should ideally be before the High Court. They must be transferred to the High Court because they raise the central question of my authority which is based on the covenant, and these civil courts don't have rights over this particular issue because this is a question of constitutional interpretation with respect to rights granted under the covenant entered into between the Indian Union and the princely state of Travancore. Therefore, the High Court must transfer all these proceedings and club all these matters together and hear them together. So remember, there was a first writ petition filed by a tenant in 2009, and all these civil suits were filed by others in the local courts of Tirunelveli. In 2010, the Maharaja files his writ petition saying let everything be heard together. So the 2009 writ petition, these civil suits and the 2010 writ petition are clubbed and they are commonly heard by the Kerala High Court. And the Kerala High Court frames a specific issue for adjudication, asking itself whether after the death of the first ruler who passed away in 1991, his younger brother, who was then the head of the family, has any right to control the Padmanabha Swami temple, and whether the covenant allows him to control the temple even after the passing away of his elder brother, coupled with the fact that since there is the 26th Amendment which abolished titles such as ruler, and sections 18 to 23 mention the word ruler and use the word ruler, since the concept of ruler itself has gone, how can we enforce the provisions of the Travancore-Cochin Act of 1950, because the concept of rulership does not exist anymore. So two questions are combined by the High Court to basically say, one, the right which was guaranteed under the covenant, was it only to the then ruler or also to his successors? In other words, whether the right to control the temple is a hereditary right that was promised under the covenant is the first question, which is inbuilt in this issue. And the second question is, after the 1971 constitutional amendment, if there is no concept of a ruler, how can we continue to respect the term ruler in the Travancore-Cochin Hindu Religious Institutions Act of 1950? let's call it the TC Act of 1950. Now, this particular judgment, or this particular proceeding, a combined proceeding where these writ petitions are consolidated in fact, results in a judgment of 30th of January 2011. Ultimately, the High Court comes to the conclusion to basically say, I'm sorry, after the elder brother's passing who signed the covenant, nobody else has any rights under the covenant. It is not a hereditary right, it is not a heritable right, it can't be inherited in succession. And second, since the 1971 amendment effectively abolished the concept of a ruler and made changes to Article 366, there is no question of, let's say, any head of the royal family continuing to have any rights with respect to the temple, and they cannot control the administration of the temple, because Chapter 3 of the Travancore-Cochin Act of 1950 has become redundant because the concept of rulership has been abolished by the 1971 amendment. Not just that, the High Court then asks itself, if the royal family does not control the temple any further, who controls this particular temple? Because at the end of the day, that institution cannot be left as an orphan. Somebody needs to control that particular institution. So the court invokes the principle of escheat under, I think, Article 296 of the Constitution to basically say, since this is a property which is no more under the control of anyone, the state has to take over that particular property. And it directs the state government to form a trust which will control the temple, control its assets and its management. All the vaults of the temple. So the temple has 6 vaults, which is believed to have a lot of treasure, which are all sacred property, which belongs to the deity. And the High Court directs the state government to open all the vaults of the temple, make an inventory of all the articles inside the vaults, and put them on display in a museum within the temple, so that tourists, devotees, and general members of the public can view these articles on the payment of a fee within the temple. Padmanabha Swami temple is a Hindu temple, it's a Hindu place, and the court's direction effectively empowered the state government to convert a part of the temple as a museum, where the sacred articles which are meant for protection as let's say articles of worship were asked to be put on public display, and the state was expected to collect a revenue based on the footfalls received at that particular museum. So when people would visit, they would make a payment and that particular amount would be collected. Of course, the court said the family shall continue to have rights with respect to the temple as far as religious aspects are concerned, but there is no question of them having any further rights on the secular aspects of administration or any part of the administration. And we will still continue to respect the religious traditions of the temple. What was missing in this entire discussion was that the relationship between the family and the temple itself was part of the religious tradition of the temple, including the administration of the temple. So the royal family appeals against this particular judgment, or rather prefers a special leave petition against the judgment of 30th of January 2011. That SLP is filed in the Supreme Court, and on day 1, stay is granted. However, the Supreme Court passes multiple orders appointing several committees for the administration of this particular temple before a final decision is arrived at. Now, in this entire period between 2009 and 11 and subsequently, most of us would remember that newspapers constantly spoke of the value of the treasure inside the temple, 30,000 crores, 40,000 crores, 2 lakh crores, 3 lakh crores and whatnot. All sorts of figures were flying around. That effectively put the temple on a hit list, because now you were inviting the vultures to get into the place, either attack the place or to steal from the place, or do something legally, give it a legal facade, because governments are usually after temple money, governments are usually after the treasures of temples. So this was an open invitation to everyone to come after this particular sacred institution, which devotees in the royal family were, they worshipped for generations together, for centuries and for millennia. As a consequence, the security at that particular temple had to be increased. And who provides the security? The temple does not have the resources to provide the security. Therefore, the state government steps into the picture and provides security. So effectively, a temple which did not need this kind of police presence currently suffers police presence only because the so-called treasure inside that particular temple became the subject of such hype and such controversy. And if people remember, the most prominent controversy about this particular temple was whether vault B must be opened because that is the vault which has the most treasure and whatnot. And the royal family's position is this vault is not supposed to be opened because it is part of the sacred treasure of the deity. Nobody ever opens this particular vault, and this vault effectively is meant to preserve the energy balance of this particular place. The Chaitanyam of the deity is protected by this particular vault. Whether you believe it or not, it is the property of the deity, so please don't touch it. That is the entire controversy. So the court ultimately appointed an amicus curiae, as well as the CAG, the former CAG, was asked. Both of them were asked to look at the status of audits and the status of administration and inventorization of certain articles and whatnot, and those reports were submitted. I don't wish to get too much into the details of the audit reports for a different reason, because or even the amicus report for a different reason, because when we entered the proceedings representing the chief tantri of the temple and devotee organizations, we effectively said that the amicus curiae appointed by the court has overstepped his boundaries, because the amicus curiae effectively started interfering with the religious practices and traditions of the temple, to the extent that in his report he said that Hanuman Chalisa must be chanted in the Padmanabha Swami temple because ultimately it's a Vishnu temple. So we had to point out that nobody else who's connected, nobody who's not connected to the traditions of the temple, much less an amicus curiae appointed by the court for a secular purpose, is in a position to comment on the religious traditions of the temple. And nobody can dictate to the temple what kind of religious practices must be carried out. That will be decided by the tantri, that will be decided by the tradition management structure, and nobody else can interfere with it, because neither are they qualified to do so, nor do they have the authority to do so. This was effectively the position that we took in court. The amicus curiae who was appointed for the purposes of this case is a well-known senior advocate of the Supreme Court, who also occupied the position of a Solicitor General under the previous dispensation. But we nevertheless took this position because what is wrong, regardless of who does it. So we effectively took that position. So the proceedings ultimately came to a point where in 2017 end, we entered the picture, meaning thereby I was asked to represent this organization called People for Dharma, which was at the forefront of the Sabarimala case, which represented the ready-to-wait movement. I was approached by the Temple Protection Movement, which is headed by or founded by the former chief priest of the Chilkur Balaji temple, Sri M.B. Soundararajan, and his son, Sri Chilkur Rangarajan, and the other son, Chilkur Murali, to represent them in court, to take a position against the judgment of the Kerala High Court, and also what they perceived as excessive interference with the religious practices of the temple by the amicus curiae, as well as the former CAG, Sri Vinod Rai, who actually prepared the report. So in 2017-18 is when we stepped into the matter, and I personally became a part of the matter as the arguing counsel for these parties. Arguments started, in fact, what was the tipping point of this case was in 2017-18, several mandapams inside the temple, which have been in existence for centuries together and which are sacred and let's say heritage buildings, were demolished in the name of expansion and renovation using JCB earth movers. And there was no concept of restoration, there was no concept of sensitive treatment of these institutions. They just went about bulldozing a lot of mandapams, and we went and complained to the court, saying this is not done, because if this is what happens, what would remain of the temple by the time the proceeding is done? And how is it that these structures are being demolished willy-nilly without any kind of permission being taken from the committee which has been appointed to oversee the management of the temple during the pendency of the litigation? So that is effectively what led to our participation in the matter. And in January 2019, or before that, Justice Lalit and Justice Chandrachud were effectively on the bench when the matter was listed for arguments on the 15th of January 2019. And by the time the matter got taken up for arguments, Justice Lalit was accompanied by Justice Indu Malhotra on the bench. And this bench heard the matter from January 2019 until 10th of April 2019, when the arguments were concluded, oral submissions were concluded, and the judgment was pronounced on the 13th of July 2020. So, the broad issue before the court is clear, which is about the interpretation of Article 8 of the Covenant, the impact of the 26th Amendment of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. What is the outcome now? So in its 218-page judgment, about 117 paragraphs, I think, the Supreme Court has come out with the following conclusions. Broadly, 3 to 4 conclusions. One, that Article 8 of the Covenant promised control of the temple not just to the signing Maharaja, but also his successors. Therefore, it was a hereditary right that was promised. And what is the right? It is in the nature of a Shebayatship or Sevayatship. So what is a Shebayatship? Shebayat effectively translates to Sevayat or Sevak, meaning thereby someone who is the servant of the deity and who represents the interests of the deity and is the guardian of the deity and the protector of the deity and the earthly representative of the deity is seen as a Sevayat. A Sevayat cannot have any kind of beneficiary interest in the property of the temple because you can't eat from the deity's property. You're not meant to have any kind of interest in the deity's property because you're the custodian of the property and custodian of the idol itself. So the court recognizes that the relationship which Article 8 of the Covenant protects is the relationship of Shebayatship or Sevayatship, and that it is a hereditary right which was promised not just to Sri Chitra Tirunal Balarama Verma, but also to his successors for eternity. And on this basis, the court also says, therefore, the very existence of specific provisions in the TC Act of 1950, namely sections 18 to 23, is the direct consequence of the obligations undertaken by the Indian Union under Article 8 of the Covenant. Therefore, the court says that there is a direct nexus between the two instruments, the Covenant and the Act. Then the court also says, while the word ruler is used in sections 18 to 23, it is not being used to nominate or to denote a person, but it is actually used as a reference to an office, which is anybody who is the head of that particular family is seen by the family as the ruler of the family, and therefore that particular person shall inherit the right from his predecessor, from his ancestor under Article 8 and thanks to Article 8. Then the court also recognizes that this relationship or this Shebayatship is not the product of any interference by the British or any title given by the British. The British may have recognized the Raja as the Raja of the princely state of Travancore, but the relationship between the Raja and the temple is not based on any recognition by the British. Even if the British had refused to recognize him as the Raja of the princely state of Travancore, he would continue to remain as the Raja for the purposes of the temple because that is in the nature of a relationship which is based on the tradition of the temple. That Sevayatship is completely independent. So in fact, we submitted on behalf of the interveners that the relationship is such that nothing in the constitutional sphere or elsewhere can have the effect of altering this sacred relationship because it is in the form of Sevayatship. So the 1971 amendment, according to us, which abolished royal titles, had no impact on this particular relationship. And since it is a hereditary right which has not been impacted by the 1971 amendment, the death of the covenanting Maharaja or the signing Maharaja in 1991 also has no impact on the rights of the successors to control and manage the temple and its affairs. That was the position that we took, and that is the position that is being endorsed. Now here it is important because Mr. Basaraj's introduction of me in this case can lead to problems of attribution. So let me just clarify who represented whom, so that there is no accusation that I am taking credit for somebody else's work. And since I also practice intellectual property, and that happens to be one of my areas about competence, I think attribution is important. So the royal family, the king, was represented by Sri Krishnan Venugopal along with advocate Sri Shyam Mohan. So senior advocate Krishnan Venugopal along with advocate Shyam Mohan. Sri Arvind P. Datta, senior advocate, represented the temple trust.
He is the son of Mr. K.K. Venugopal?
Yes, he is the son of Mr. K.K. Venugopal, correct. And I represented the chief tantri of the temple, People for Dharma and Temple Protection Movement, and Ms. Usha Nandini represented the Yogatil Kotimar. I'll explain who they are as well. The other Brahmins who are part of the temple management structure, they were represented. Sri P.B. Suresh represented the tenant in the Supreme Court. The practicing advocate was represented by Advocate P.B. Suresh. The state government of Kerala was represented by Senior Advocate Jaideep Gupta. So these are the participants, these are the councils. Effectively, the court accepted all submissions with respect to Article 8. What is the submission that the court chose not to get into? So since we were representing the Tantri, we also presented arguments with respect to Articles 25 and 26. We submitted to the court that the relationship between the temple and the Maharaja is in the nature of a religious right or a tradition which is protected by Article 25(1), because this right is recognized in the religious scripture and the tradition of the temple, and therefore it needs to be protected as an essential part of the temple's identity, as an integral part of the temple's identity. Then we also said that since this temple represents one of the few temples that follows what is known as the Parashurama Paddhati, or what is known as the Paddhati Sampradayam in Kerala, it qualifies as a religious denomination within the Vaishnavite denomination or the Vaishnavite group. It is a very specific group of temples. So therefore we said that the temple is protected by Article 26 and the relationship is protected by Article 25. Therefore, no kind of state presence can be allowed in this particular temple, because the limitation of the state with respect to a denominational temple is even more. Now the court said that none of these arguments with respect to Articles 25 and 26 were ever raised before the High Court proceeding. That is a fact. Nobody raised Articles 25 and 26. And therefore the court said, why should we consider something that was not raised? So we made three limbs of our submission. One limb was Article 8, the second limb was Articles 25 and 26. The court accepted our submission with respect to Article 8, and similar submissions or different aspects of the same submissions on Article 8 were made by Mr. Krishnan Venugopal as well as by Mr. Arvind Datta. We made the argument that 1971 cannot do anything to this particular relationship because it is independent of the British. It is not in the nature of a title, it's in the name of a Shivayat. So that part of the argument was accepted. But in Article 25 and 26, the court effectively said, look, one, people did not raise this argument in the High Court. And two, since we are already recognizing the right of Shivayatship through Article 8, why should we get into this particular question? So the court effectively did not reject the argument, it merely refused to look into this particular question, given that the same conclusion was arrived at through another route. And we pointed out to the Supreme Court also that any structure or any administrative structure that the court lays down with respect to the temple has to be consistent with the covenant and the rights given in the covenant, the autonomy given under the covenant. And therefore, Articles 25 and 26 can also become relevant, because if it's a denominational institution, that the court must respect the autonomy of the temple even more. But the court, for technical reasons, chose not to get into Articles 25 and 26. The other argument that we raised before the court, which the court did not accept, is the argument based on Article 363 of the Constitution. Article 363 of the Constitution bars the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in matters relating to covenants, treaties, any kind of, let's say, documents, instruments entered into by the Indian Union with either a third party or anybody else, including with the princely states. So we said that if this entire case revolves around the interpretation of Article 8 of the Covenant, then Article 363 effectively applies, because it bars the jurisdiction of both the High Court as well as the Supreme Court. And if the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is barred, it can't be anybody's case that the High Court's jurisdiction is upheld. And therefore, we said that the judgment of the High Court must fall completely for want of jurisdiction, because this is an issue that effectively ought to have been escalated to the Honorable President of India, His Excellency, as required by Article 363. And the only role that the Supreme Court can perform is the advisory role, as and when the President asks for an advice under Articles 143 read with Articles 131, to basically say the role of the Supreme Court of India is advisory in nature when it comes to Article 363 and not adjudicate. In paragraph 110 of the judgment, I think the court rejects this particular argument, citing a host of decisions. So while that happened, let's come to the administrative structure. What is it that the court has said? So I said that sections 18 to 23 of chapter 3 has a certain administrative structure. Raja at the top appoints an executive officer for administrative functions, is advised by an advisory 3-member advisory committee in the performance of his functions. Now what has happened? So 3 sets of proposals